All right, we are live. Welcome to this webinar organized by PSYTY, the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research. My name is Samuli Kangaslampi. I'm a psychologist and researcher and current chairperson of the association. This evening, we're very happy to have with us Simon Ruffell, psychiatrist and researcher. So welcome, Simon. Before we get started, just a couple of practical things. We will start with Simon's talk, and then there will be time for questions and comments. So if you want, you can post your questions for the speaker in Zoom's Q&A section. And then in the Q&A session, when your question is chosen, we'll give permission for you to open your microphone and you can ask your question out loud. If you don't want to ask the question yourself, you can indicate this at the end of your written question, and I will then read your question instead. And you can also select to submit your questions anonymously. In the Q&A section, you should see a button to get there. You can also see questions others have posted, and you can upvote questions that you'd like to hear answered. And please note that this webinar is being recorded for later publication again on our YouTube channel. We already have quite a number of webinars and other recordings available at youtube.com/psyty. But now, let me briefly introduce our guest and get things going. Dr. Simon Ruffell is a medical doctor and psychiatrist by background. He worked at King's College London as senior research associate, investigating psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. But since 2016, he has also conducted research into ayahuasca, especially in the Peruvian Amazon, especially its effects on mental health and mechanisms of action, including epigenetics. So this is a topic of his doctoral research work just about to be completed at Goldsmiths University of London, and also the topic of his talk tonight. So thank you very much indeed for being with us, Simon, and please go right ahead.
Thank you so much, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, my name's Simon, and I'm a psychiatrist and researcher, and I've been looking into ayahuasca for the last 7 years. And today I'm going to speak to you about that research, the majority of which has taken place looking at retreats in the Amazon rainforest. And then I'm going to start introducing some of the work that we're doing looking at ayahuasca or ayahuasca-inspired products in lab-based settings. So we're going to start off today by talking about what ayahuasca actually is, before we speak about the setting of the research. We're going to briefly touch on ayahuasca tourism before discussing ayahuasca and personality, which is the first study that we completed. I'm then going to speak to you about phenomenology, the phenomenology of ayahuasca, before moving on to the pharmacology. And then we're going to speak about the effects of ayahuasca on mental health and epigenetics, before looking at the effects of ayahuasca on nature connectedness, so how connected people feel to nature and how they relate to it. And then I'm going to introduce the randomized control trials and we're doing based in hospitals looking at ayahuasca, and also consider the ethics of doing these trials. So before we get going, why bother? Why bother researching ayahuasca or psychedelics in general? So many people today say that we're in the middle of a mental health crisis. It's true that over 300 million people suffer from depression across the globe. Just to put that in context, that's roughly the population of the United States of America. And that's 5% of adults. About a third of people don't respond to 3 antidepressants when they're prescribed to them. And NICE, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, that's in the UK, recommends that cognitive behavior therapy is used as first-line psychotherapy treatment for participants, for patients. But again, this is only 50% effective. Research into new ways of treating mental health problems has really slowed since the turn of the millennium. And many of the new treatments that we do have really lack innovation. And they're just reformulations of pre-existing drug treatments. So a little bit about me and how I got into this work. So I've been working in the NHS as a medical doctor for a few years, and I've been working in psychiatry. And I began to get a little bit dismayed about the way that we were treating some of our patients. Specifically, I found that patients came back time and time again. When you discharged them, they would just come back again after a few months. And this happens so much that we even have a term for it. We call it the revolving door syndrome. And so I decided to take a bit of a break from medicine, and I traveled to Central America. And I actually, one day when I was sitting in a cafe, found myself sitting next to somebody who was training to be a shaman completely by chance. And I started talking to him, and he'd been using this psychedelic plant called ayahuasca. And he'd been using it to treat many of the conditions that I've been struggling to treat in hospitals back home. And so I was fascinated by what he was telling me. And so when he invited me to come down to the Amazon rainforest in Peru with him to see the work that he was doing, I said yes, and I went with him. And I had my first experience drinking ayahuasca. I was completely blown away by the effect that it had, both on me personally and on the other participants who were there on the retreat as well. And so I excitedly started looking into the research that had been done into ayahuasca. And although there was research looking at ayahuasca, this was mainly either in lab-based settings or looking at ayahuasca churches, which are mainly found in Brazil, although they are spreading around the world now, that combine Christianity with ayahuasca. And I was quite surprised to see that there was a gap in the literature, really, specifically looking at ayahuasca in retreat centers in the Amazon rainforest. And so I called one of my colleagues, Nigel Netzband, who's a psychologist back in the UK, and we designed our first study looking into ayahuasca. We tried to get funding for that study, but perhaps unsurprisingly, at that time, nobody wanted to fund that research. And so we self-funded our first study looking at ayahuasca and personality. And following that study, fortunately, we did manage to get some more funding, and that's continued to happen, which has allowed us to continue doing this research based in the Amazon rainforest. Okay. So what actually is ayahuasca? Now, this is actually a surprisingly difficult question to answer because ayahuasca is many different things to many different people. But very simply put, ayahuasca is a concoction of the Amazonian vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, and the DMT-containing leaves, Psychotria viridis, or it can be different leaves, but this is the one that's most commonly used. And normally, when you consume DMT orally, the DMT would be broken down by the enzymes in the stomach, and you wouldn't get the psychedelic effects that are associated with DMT. But when you combine Psychotria viridis leaves with the Banisteriopsis caapi, the beta-carbolines, or the hormonal alkaloids in the ayahuasca vine, prevent the breakdown of DMT in the stomach. And so DMT gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and we get the intense psychedelic effects associated with DMT. So ayahuasca very loosely translates to the vine or the rope of the dead or the souls. And when you drink it, you can have extreme changes in your sense of perception. So you can see or hear things that other people can't see or hear. And sometimes people have introspective experiences. It changes in their thinking and the way they process their emotions. Ayahuasca is quite famously associated with the purge, which is vomiting, but it's not just vomiting. So the purge can be a release of anything, really. So it can be emotions, it can be crying, it can be sweating, shaking, diarrhea. And some people even believe that when you drink ayahuasca, you can connect with the divine. Ayahuasca is used for many different things. It's used as a medicine, as a sacrament, and as a tool for spiritual development. It's used for scientific inquiry. Historically, it was more often used for warfare and hunting, but that's beginning to change. And we'll speak a bit about that in a sec. And more recently, it's been used for tourism and also as a sense of pilgrimage. It's been suggested that ayahuasca has therapeutic potential in a number of different areas. So psychologically, it can increase mindfulness and decentering, as well as cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to be able to swap easily psychologically between different situations. It has neurobiological effects, so it can reduce activity in the default mode network. This is an area of 3 connector hubs in the brain, and these are usually found to be overactive when people are depressed or they're ruminating. And it's also what takes over when you're just daydreaming and you're not focusing on anything. Ayahuasca increases neuroplasticity, which is the ability of neurons in the brain to form new connections. It affects the serotonin receptors, much like many of the other psychedelics and also the antidepressants that we use today, at least the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It can hyperactivate the amygdala, which is part of the brain that's involved in emotional processing and trauma. It can also activate sigma-1 receptors as well, and that's hypothesized to be involved in traumatic memory recall. I think it's all very well saying that these are the ways that ayahuasca can work, which is true. But I think it's all too easy to approach ayahuasca saying that we know best as Western scientists. The traditional way of thinking is just something that isn't correct, but we actually know what's going on. So I want to briefly mention healing through the Shipibo lens. So the Shipibos are one of the main tribes and communities that work with ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest. And they're also the community that we conduct the research with. And I don't think they would necessarily disagree with what we spoke about on the previous slide, but I think they would probably say that you're missing the point. They would say it's the plant spirits in the ceremony that cause the healing. And the Shipibo shamans get to know the plant spirits by doing things called plant dietas. So they spend extended amounts of time in isolation, consuming parts of what they believe to be enlightened plants, such as Noya Rao, which we have here on this tree. And then they form allies with these plant spirits. And in the actual ceremonies, it's the plant spirits that are causing the healing by moving energy through participants. The whole of the Shipibo worldview is based on animism, which is the idea that everything has a spirit, everything has a soul. So it's not just the plants, it's also rivers, rocks, trees, all of these things. And this way of thinking can be quite difficult to interpret through a Western lens. But there are some times where there is convergence between the different ways of thinking. So, for example, when we started doing research into epigenetics, I was trying to explain this to the shamans that we work with, which was particularly difficult because it was all through translators. But I was trying to describe that the field of epigenetics looks at the way that genes can be kind of cranked up or cranked down depending on our environment. So you get different genes that express more or less, and this can be the case when it comes to trauma. So there are some interesting studies looking at famines in Scandinavia and also looking at the Holocaust. They show that people who have experienced trauma have certain genes that become either more or less expressed, and those are passed down through various generations. And according to mice and rat studies, it seems that lasts for at least 13 generations, but we're not sure how long that is in humans. And when I described that to the curanderos, to the shamans, and explained that I wanted to see whether or not ayahuasca had an effect on that, changing the expression of these genes and potentially reducing the effects of trauma, they said, oh, that's the same as cleaning ancestral lines. So there is some overlap, but it can be difficult to interpret through a Western lens sometimes. Okay. So our research conducted in the Amazon rainforest takes place in the Mashana National Reserve. This is a community of 80 indigenous people. There's no mains, electricity, or phone signal or internet there, and it's 2 hours away from the nearest town, which is Iquitos in Peru. And the name of the research center is Riosbo, and it's affiliated with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is MAPS. And we work with traditional healers, very experienced healers such as Don Rono here, as we can see on this slide. So this is the location of the Mashana community. As we can see, it's right in the heart of the Peruvian Amazon. And this is the Mashana community itself. And this is Riosbo, which is the retreat and research center that we're based at. So before participants engage in their ayahuasca retreats, they're advised to prepare both the mind and the body. So for 2 weeks, or at least 2 weeks, before they drink ayahuasca, they have a washout period. Here, they're required to change their diet and start the famous ayahuasca diet. So here, they need to avoid things like fortified wines, and particularly mature cheeses. This is to avoid high levels of tyramine, which can interact with some of the substances in ayahuasca and potentially cause a hypertensive crisis, which could be fatal. They're also required to come off medications, and this is typically antidepressants and any other medications that could lead to increased levels of serotonin, something, again, that can be fatal, called serotonin syndrome. I should also point out here that serotonin syndrome is actually quite heavily debated in the literature in terms of ayahuasca. It's mainly based on a study from the 90s by Charles Grob that described the effects of serotonin syndrome after drinking ayahuasca. However, many of the symptoms, such as sweating and having a distorted sensorium, are actually some of the same things that happen when you drink ayahuasca. And there are many people who have been taking antidepressants whilst drinking ayahuasca in the ayahuasca churches in Brazil. There's not one case of serotonin syndrome recorded in the literature that has been damaging, and it's thought to be on a bit of a spectrum. So it is debated, but better safe than sorry. And most of the shamans would recommend coming off the vast majority of medications. There are also various behavioral restrictions. So participants are required to think about what they're putting into their minds as well. So avoiding any sexual contact for 2 weeks beforehand, also avoiding any things like horror films or basically extreme things, trying to calm the mind and the body. For many, it's important to prepare an intention, to think about why you want to drink ayahuasca, what you are hoping to achieve from doing so. So, for example, to have a better understanding of your relationship with your family would be quite a common one. Increasingly important these days is to try and manage the expectations of participants. So one thing that we see in the trials, especially when I was based at King's doing the psilocybin trials, but also in the jungle, so due to the coverage in the media of psychedelics and psychedelic trials, many people expect to come and have a life-changing, earth-shattering experience, which does happen for a lot of people. But also, for a lot of people, it doesn't happen for whatever reasons. I think people from the West quite often expect what we refer to as the light show when they drink ayahuasca. So they want to have an extreme visionary experience. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it's introspection. Sometimes it feels like it's not doing anything at all. But quite often the traditional way of thinking about it would be that the ayahuasca is working. It's just not particularly obvious. So we need to make sure that people are aware that that could happen, that they could be slightly underwhelmed from what they expect. So the ceremonies take place in a wooden structure called a maloka. This is thought to be sacred by the Shipibo community. And participants sit around the outside of this structure. And there's usually about 8 to 10 mattresses for participants and a bucket for the purge. So this is the vomiting that we spoke about before. The ceremonies take place at night and they last for around 6 hours. And it's done in the pitch black. And there's a lot of use of a jungle tobacco called mapacho. And that's mainly for protection, but also has some other functions. Everyone, including the shaman or the curandero, actually drinks the ayahuasca, and the facilitators as well. There's usually between 2 and 3 facilitators, either indigenous or Western. And throughout the ceremony, the shaman sings medicine songs called icaros. And it's through these icaros that they believe the healing is occurring by connecting with their plant spirit allies and moving energy through the space. After the ceremonies, the integration period begins, and this is usually with sharing circles that take place the morning afterwards. People can explain their experiences, people can have discussion with their peers and their facilitators, and it can help people to understand better what happened to them. Integration following the retreats is recommended as well. So participants are recommended to engage in psychotherapy sessions, but that's obviously not enforced, and some people do that to different degrees. So before we go any further, I just want to briefly touch on ayahuasca tourism. I think it's important that we acknowledge this, and indeed, I don't think we can discuss research based in retreat centers without touching on ayahuasca tourism. So since over the last kind of 15, 20 years, ayahuasca has dramatically increased in popularity. It's now present all over the world, and there are increasing numbers of people flying to the Amazon rainforest in order to drink ayahuasca. And some people have argued that this might be diluting tradition. So as we mentioned previously, ayahuasca historically was used more for warfare and for hunting. But since more Western people have started drinking ayahuasca, so it began to create a demand based on the perception of what ayahuasca is for Western people. People quite often associate it with love and healing, and ayahuasca certainly is all about that. But traditionally, especially with the Shipibos, there was a much greater emphasis on things like warfare, witchcraft, and hunting. And many of the shamans today have started not to train in those things and only to focus on the healing because that's where the demand is. Now, it might seem like that's a good thing. I'm not saying whether it is or it's not, but I think that we need to be aware that the tradition is subtly changing as a result of Western interest. There are also concerns in terms of the environment. This isn't just to do with people flying over to the rainforest to drink ayahuasca, but also to do with the sustainable harvesting of the vine. So it takes at least 7 years for a vine to reach maturity, and some people aren't harvesting it appropriately. There are safety concerns as well. So ayahuasca is largely unregulated throughout South America, or indeed throughout most of the rest of the world. And so sometimes you get people who don't have the appropriate training running ayahuasca ceremonies. To become an ayahuasca shaman or a curandero is very much like studying medicine. It takes years. You do 5 initial years, and then you do more training after that, and you become more senior. But there's no official certificate or regulation, unlike medicine in the West. So you have people who just say they're a shaman, say they're a curandero. And so it's up to people to figure out who they need to drink with, largely by word of mouth. And unfortunately, some of these charlatans use materials that are cheaper to get hold of instead of actual ayahuasca. And this can lead to psychological or even physical damage, and indeed financial exploitation. Unfortunately, in recent times, it's no longer uncommon to hear of sexual exploitation. I was about to say within ayahuasca circles, but it seems like this is the case in psychedelic research in general. And this has actually got to the point where there's been guidelines for the awareness of sexual abuse released by shakruna.net, and also an ethical code by Plantiforma. And I recommend that anyone who's considering drinking ayahuasca has a look at these documents online. Others have raised concerns that ayahuasca tourism might lead to commodification of ayahuasca. Could this be a case of cultural appropriation or indeed biopiracy? Is this another form of neo-colonialism where there's a market controlled by non-locals? Many of the retreat centers that employ local shamans are run by quite often American people, that's from the United States. Is that unfair? When there are large amounts of money coming into these small communities as well, lots of US American dollars, that can actually destabilize the communities. It might seem like it's a good thing, but it can be problematic too. But for many, ayahuasca tourism and these retreats leads to healing, meaning, and community. And some have even argued that if done correctly, ayahuasca tourism might help to promote and even protect traditions, with Shipibos having a sudden burst of interest in the last 10 to 20 years. Okay. So the first study that we conducted was looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. So this was in the retreat center that I described before, and this was an observational repeated measures design. So we analyzed participants' personality immediately before the first ceremony and immediately following their final ceremony after the retreat, and then again 6 months later to look for longer-term changes. The retreats lasted for 12 days, and there were 6 ayahuasca ceremonies during that time. And we also conducted semi-structured interviews in order to get a more holistic idea of what was going on in the retreats. We'll speak about that in a sec. So here we had a sample of 24 participants, 9 of which are female. These were primarily from a Western population, and they were vetted by the retreat center, which is the Ayahuasca Foundation. 12 of the participants had historical or ongoing diagnosed psychiatric conditions, so mental health problems. 14 had physical health problems, and 4 didn't have either of the above. 6 had never tried psychedelics before, 18 had, 8 of which had drank ayahuasca. And we also had a comparison group. So these were participants who were traveling around South America. They were backpacking, but they weren't drinking ayahuasca. And the reason that we did this was to try and control for something that we've called the Mallorca effect, which is the idea that just by going to South America and getting away from your everyday life, that might lead to changes in the measures that we were looking at. So we used the NEO-PI3 in order to assess personality. That's really the gold standard of looking at personality. And it looks at personality in 5 different domains, together known as OCEAN, or the Big Five. It's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We also use the mystical experience questionnaire to assess mystical or peak experiences. So that's things such as being outside of time, feeling like you were connected to the world around you, feeling a sense of oneness, or being connected to God. And we found that participants had statistically significant decreases in how neurotic they were immediately following the ayahuasca retreat in compared to the comparison group. And further, that was maintained at 6-month follow-up. We also found that there were significant increases in how agreeableness participants were feeling immediately after the retreat, and again, maintained a 6-month follow-up. We found that the decreases in how neurotic participants were actually negatively correlated with mystical experience. So the greater the peak experience, the greater the participants had felt they were connected to God and the other things we mentioned before, the greater the decreases in neuroticism. There were a lot of limitations in this study, so just to list a few of them. We had limited access to equipment, and because we were looking, because the study took place in the Amazon rainforest. There were also no set doses of ayahuasca. So the doses that were given were largely up to the shaman. He used his intuition in order to choose how much he gave, and also the willingness of the participant on the day. And although normally that would be considered a limitation in terms of research, because we were conducting observational research, I would argue that trying to control the actual dose would really take away from the naturalistic design. Although it would have been good to actually look to analyze the samples so we could see the quantities of DMT compared to MOAIs, that would have been very beneficial. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that. And also with all of this research, there's a clear self-selection bias. So it takes a certain kind of person to go to the Amazon rainforest in order to drink ayahuasca. And there are many barriers in order to do that. So taking time off work, these retreats aren't cheap. And also people who are kind of open enough in order to do that. It's not everyone's cup of tea to drink ayahuasca with a shaman in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. There was also a relatively small sample size in this study, so we need to be careful when generalizing these results. Okay. So following this, we conducted a phenomenological analysis of the participants in the previous study based on the semi-structured interviews to try and get a more holistic idea of what was actually happening during the ayahuasca ceremonies. So we collected 9 narrative interviews and we used qualitative content analysis in order to assess these interviews. We didn't have any hypothesis. We just wanted to see what the data showed. So it's a data-driven strategy, and we used that strategy in order to extract various themes. And we came up with 3 themes. One major theme, which was experiences during the actual ceremony, and then 2 sub-themes, smaller themes. So preparedness before the ceremony and also appraisal of the process. So preparedness referred largely to people's level of motivation going into the ceremonies and what actually motivated them to engage, and also their level of knowledge regarding ayahuasca and before they drank. Appraisal of the process was largely about problems or difficult experiences that had happened during the ceremonies. So people described feeling like they were losing control and feeling that the experience was very intense. In this category as well, the role of the shamanic singing came up largely as a modulating factor. And so the singing was found to influence things like the visions that people were having, the physical effects. So people would say that they would start purging when the shaman started singing, for example. And also they would feel a change in their mood or their energy. The experiences during the ceremony were split up into 9 different categories. We found that the physical experience, quite unsurprisingly, was mentioned by all participants. So the majority of participants described vomiting, and those vomitings were found to be associated with having changes in their visual experience, in the thoughts that they were having, and also their level of agitation. So typically participants would describe feeling more calm after they'd vomited. About half the participants experienced nausea as well. And then various other physical effects were described, such as stomach pain and diarrhea, people having tremors, and some people having a sense of heaviness or exhaustion. 8 out of the 9 participants described having some kind of visual experience. And the majority of these were abstract visions, and they were experienced during when people had closed eyes or in darkness. So they weren't true hallucinations when there was no difference between open and closed eyes. Some people also described seeing fantastic or weird creatures, and then others scenes and people as well. I've just got a quote here for you to read that demonstrates that. So for the majority of participants, they described having a spontaneously meaningful experience. So they were able to immediately understand what the experience meant, and a lot of that was personal reflections. So for example, and to me, to kind of resolve, just to move on with my life and to never have to think about that again, and to start, a better relationship with someone else. For 3 of the participants, however, it appeared quite confusing, and they were unable to understand the content of their ceremonies. And for a minority, there was recognized symbolism. And so suddenly it just occurred to me that this was a symbol for my inner child. So for 3 out of the 9 participants, they felt that they communicated with entities in the ceremonial space. This was described as either communication with Mother Ayahuasca, messages from family members, or from unspecified entities. And this came across in either an explaining or a teaching style. Some people had therapeutic orders or suggestions, but it was always in a supportive and a calming manner. And suddenly I heard the voice of my mum, and she says, "You don't have to find anything. I am always here. I am always here. You just have to turn to me, towards me. And I am here anyhow, because I am your mum. My love is always here. And you are the one who turned away. You are the one who decided to go away. The moment you turn around, I am always here." In terms of the recognized meaning of content, 7 out of the 9 participants described having insightful and personal meaning. And this came across as interpersonal psychological insights into relational, social, and biographic themes, into the motives of other people, into the issues of others, sometimes into general social and ethical healing aspects of mankind and issues to do with the environment. And then for half the participants, mystical and spiritual insights. And I started asking questions to ayahuasca, questions that I think most people think about, like, why is there life on Earth? What happens after you die? Questions you can normally never have an answer to. And I felt those questions were just answered immediately. The answers were kind of implanted into my brain. And I remember lying on my mat thinking, how can this possibly be? So in terms of the reactions of the individuals, the majority of people acted outside of their visions. So, for example, they were found to repeat words to themselves in some kind of a monologue. They would try to relax by changing their position, or maybe try and hold back vomiting. Maybe they'd have some mannerisms, or they become aware of what was happening with other participants in the ceremony. But for two of the participants, they started interacting with their visions. So I saw a little kind of Joker being, and I asked him, as I was told to do, if it was medicine to stay, and if it was not, to go away. And then I was brightly transported into a really brightly colored scene. In terms of cognitive reactions, 6 out of the 9 participants described having doubts and having worrying thoughts. Some people tried to control and reject content. Others had intensified thoughts. Half the participants got absorbed by the experience. And one person had an inordinate thought process. The vast majority of participants, 8 of them, described having therapeutically desirable emotions. All the participants had unpleasant emotions at some point during the ceremony, and 4 people had a hedonistic emotional state. And so we define that as basically just having a really good time. In terms of the therapeutically desirable emotions, people felt love and connection, gratitude, calmness and relaxation, acceptance and openness to others, as well as feeling supported and nourished and self-understood. I'll let you read this quote here that supports that. The unpleasant emotions that participants experienced were largely anxiety, but other people experienced a sense of nervousness, and also the 3 out of the 9 had a loss of control. But interestingly, 8 out of the 9 participants we found experienced unpleasant emotions alongside their therapeutically desirable emotion. So they'd experience the unpleasant emotion, and then following that, there would be a therapeutically desirable emotion. And so that led us to question whether or not there could be a relationship between these two things. And could that be a transitional emotional state? So could that be indicative of a psychodynamic process, that there's an activation of emotional conflicts, and then those are resolved? So almost like regular psychotherapy, but obviously in a shorter time period. But it's also important to remember that the setting and expectation of participants when they came into the ceremonies would very likely influence their experiences. So, for example, when we're talking about communication with entities and the personal teachings like Mother Ayahuasca, we can't ignore the fact that most people would have been expecting something like that to happen before they drank the brew. Okay. So following this study, we conducted a pharmacological systematic review of the components of ayahuasca to try and better understand what was happening in the brew. So here we looked at different databases online, and we found over 2,000 papers initially. After initial screening, we reduced these to 200 relevant ones, and then we screened those and found 16 that were appropriate for the review. So just briefly, we found that when DMT was ingested orally, it wasn't active without the Hamala alkaloids present. We also found that DMT deamination was prevented by the Hamala alkaloids, so it prevented the breakdown of DMT in the stomach. And there was evidence that DMT had been an agonist for various serotonin receptors. Furthermore, we found that the Hamala alkaloids were also binding to the serotonin receptors, so it wasn't just DMT. We found that harmine, the most prevalent Hamala alkaloid usually in ayahuasca, was increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor in rats, which has antidepressant effects. And we found the THH, tetrahydroharmine, which is another one of the Hamala alkaloids, was also a weak selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So that's the same class of antidepressant as Prozac. And And we found that those who were drinking ayahuasca had increased platelet serotonin uptake sites, which could suggest that there are increased serotonin uptake sites in the brain and in the nervous system. And interestingly, that wasn't the case when people had just consumed DMT alone. It was only when there was the combination that we see with ayahuasca. There's a fantastic study suggesting that harmine could cause neurogenesis, so the growth of new neurons in adult mice in hippocampal cells. And we also found that there were studies showing that ayahuasca activated frontal and paralimbic brain regions, which are associated with both interoception and also emotional processing. The default mode network was found to decrease in activity in various studies, but there were other areas that increased in connectivity, such as the anterior cingulate cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex too. So we concluded from this review that although it had previously been considered that DMT and the Hamala alkaloids interacted in an additive manner, it seems likely that there's probably more complex synergistic mechanisms at work. However, as always, further research is needed to fully explore this. Great. So following this study, we decided to start looking at the effects of ayahuasca on mental health outcomes, as well as epigenetics back in the Amazon rainforest. In this study, we had a similar design to our first study on personality. So it was a naturalistic observational study. However, in this study, we had a larger sample of 65 participants, and we assessed participants immediately before, immediately following their retreats, and also 6 months later as before. But we had a larger battery of inventories. So before the study started, we assessed participants demographically, and then also looked at their level of childhood trauma. So we wanted to see whether or not the amount of childhood trauma was mediating any of the mental health outcomes, or indeed other outcomes to do with well-being that we were looking at. Following the ayahuasca experience, we again used the mystical experience questionnaire. So we were looking at the peak experiences that participants had undergone. And then before, after, and 6 months later, we looked at depression, anxiety, self-compassion, general well-being. And we also looked at memory, specifically the way in which people perceive the memory. So it wasn't looking at a change in memory, it was the emotional affect, the emotion associated with that memory. We also conducted semi-structured interviews as before to try and get a more holistic idea of what was happening in these retreats, as well as epigenetics. So like we spoke about before, epigenetics is the field of study looking at the effect of the environment on the epigenome and the way that genes are expressed. And this was actually the first study that had ever looked at any psychedelic and epigenetics. And we collected saliva samples from participants immediately before and immediately after the ayahuasca retreats. So we found that there were statistically significant decreases in how participants rated their levels of depression immediately following their ayahuasca retreats. And this continued to decrease at 6-month follow-up. Similarly, we found that participants had statistically significant decreases in how anxious they were immediately after their retreat, and this just about continued to decrease at 6-month follow-up. We found that self-compassion increased following the retreats, and again, this continued to increase at 6-month follow-up, and participants' levels of global distress decreased following the retreat, and again, this was maintained at 6-month follow-up. In terms of people's memory, we found that participants viewed their memories in a less negative light as a result of drinking ayahuasca or being on the ayahuasca retreat. And this was the case immediately after the retreat and also 6 months later. So no change to the actual memory. It was just the way in which they perceived that memory that had become less negative. We found that the level of childhood trauma that participants had disclosed was correlated with the decreases in depression. So here we were using depression as a proxy for the other mental health and well-being outcomes, as they all followed a similar pattern. And so we found that those with a greater degree of childhood trauma had a greater decrease in depression after their ayahuasca retreats. And the same as the previous research, we found that the level of mystical experience was associated with decrease in depression. So the higher the rating of peak experiences, the greater the decreases in depression. In terms of epigenetics, we found that one of the genes that we looked at, the sigma-1 receptor, had an increase in methylation. So we looked at 3 genes. We looked at BDNF, FKBP5, and sigma-1. Unfortunately, the BDNF evaluation failed, and then we went into COVID, so we couldn't rerun it. FKBP5 didn't show any positive results, any significant results, but sigma-1, which is associated with a wide variety of things such as neuroprotection, neuroplasticity, and is hypothesized to be involved with the recall of traumatic memories, did show an increase in methylation. Now, it's unclear exactly what these results mean. Firstly, because an increase in methylation would usually mean that the gene activity is downregulated, which isn't what we'd expect to see, but not always. So that could be a true finding. And although it's a particularly exciting and an interesting finding, we need to be very careful with generalizing these results, as we only analyzed around 50 participants in terms of epigenetic change. And before we can reliably generalize these kind of results, we need to be looking at really hundreds and hundreds. So I'll keep you posted on these findings. We fortunately got some more funding to keep looking at this. So I'll be delighted to come back in a couple of years and tell you what we find. So as a result of this study, we concluded that there were significant improvements in mental health and associated wellness as a result of attending the ayahuasca retreats in the Amazon rainforest. And furthermore, these improvements seem to be sustained at 6-month follow-up. And this suggested that ayahuasca retreats could induce lasting therapeutic effect. Furthermore, the epigenetic analysis suggests that sigma-1 methylation might be a biological mechanism of change. But once again, as always, further research is needed before we can generalize these results. Okay, so moving on to our most recent study based in the Amazon. So in this study, we were looking at participants' association with nature, so their connection to nature and the way they relate to it. And here we had a sample of 58 participants, and we only collected quantitative data from participants immediately before and immediately after retreats. We looked at nature relatedness using the nature relatedness scale, as well as depression, anxiety, and mystical experience, as per before. But here we also used the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire as well, in order to assess participants' levels of mindfulness. We found statistically significant decreases in how depressed participants were immediately after the retreats. And in this study, we split anxiety into trait and state anxiety. So trait anxiety is more of your standard level of anxiety. It's less affected by what's going on in your life, whereas state anxiety is more transient and is highly affected by events that are happening. So a good comparison is a little bit like comparing it to the weather and climate, for example. And we found that there were significant decreases in both trait and state anxiety, slightly more so in the state anxiety after drinking ayahuasca. We also found that there were increases in how mindful participants were, and also increases in their level of nature connectedness. So we found that the increase in nature connectedness was associated with decreases in depression, state, and trait anxiety. So as people became more connected to nature, there were more significant decreases in depression and anxiety. But interestingly, with this study, we didn't find any association with the mystical experience to our mental health and well-being outcomes. And there is some literature that shows this, but mainly the mystical experience has been associated with these changes. And there's a variety of reasons as to why that could have been the case. So, for example, we were using the mystical experience questionnaire in a non-normal way. So normally it's for one mystical experience, but we were using it for the whole retreat. So that could have been why it didn't work. Also, this was quite a small sample size, so it might be that we didn't have enough power in order to detect that. Interestingly, with this study, we didn't find any association between the number of ceremonies that participants had attended and research outcomes. So it didn't really seem to matter how many times people had drunk ayahuasca. As long as they just drank it a few times, the benefits seemed to be obtained, at least according to these measures. And this has been echoed in previous research, both in our previous research and also other people who have started looking at the use of ayahuasca in retreat centers. Maybe this means that you don't need lots of ayahuasca, or maybe this is a shortcoming of some of the measures that we use. I think it's probably the latter, that we're already hitting a ceiling effect, and our measures just can't pick up on any additional benefits that are happening. Also particularly interesting was that there was a trend towards significance, towards the amount of days that was spent on retreat and the improvements in mental health measures. So although ayahuasca didn't seem to be associated, the amount of ayahuasca consumed didn't seem to be associated with changes in the mental health outcome measures, the amount of days that people had spent in the jungle on the retreat and was working its way towards significance. And so this led us to conclude that could it be that at least some of the benefits from ayahuasca are happening because of the biodiverse setting being in the Amazon rainforest, or indeed the shamanic tradition? Like we spoke about before, I think it's important that we don't discard the psychospiritual effects that could be happening as a result of the work that the curanderos and the shamans are doing. We also want to suggests that nature-relatedness might have a clinical application as a potential pathway for improved mental health outcomes. So nature-relatedness hasn't really been looked at all that much in terms of improvements in mental health, but it would be a fantastic tool to use. It's completely free, and it's good to have those spending time in nature, and maybe we don't need to be taking pharmaceuticals in order to achieve that. Okay. So before we go any further, I just want to ask this question. I think it's important that we keep checking ourselves when we're doing this kind of research, especially with ayahuasca. Is ayahuasca research ethical? I don't think we can deny that there's a large amount of data that's required. There's huge amounts of anecdotal claims about ayahuasca. All you have to do is type ayahuasca into Google and you hear about Lindsay Lohan claiming that it solved all of her problems. But then you also have these horror stories. Like in the UK, there's a young man who was 19 from Bristol who died just after drinking ayahuasca after a ceremony. So I think it's important that we collect data to try and determine what is actually going on in these retreats and shed some light on the potential benefits and indeed the potential harms. Like we've mentioned before, there's a stagnation in treatments, so it might be that ayahuasca could help to inspire some new ways of treating mental health problems in the West. And I just want to bring up reciprocity as well. So the idea of giving back, who actually benefits from doing this research. I mean, fortunately, the shamans that I work with obviously are very, very keen on the research, and they want to disseminate information on the work that they do to the West. But there are also big benefits for myself and the other researchers. We get to use this research and give these talks, and so there's something in it for us. And there are many ways to give back, not just money, so kind of sharing knowledge and a wide variety of other things. So we're currently setting up a reciprocity database, which is designed to prevent Indigenous people from keep having to have the same conversations regarding reciprocity, so we can share that around with other researchers, as well as ayahuasca pledges and people who do research in ayahuasca pledging to do so and conduct their research ethically. And then we also give back financially to RAIN, which is the Regenerative Agroforestry Impact Network. So there are all these ways to give back, but it's a very difficult area, and we need to think very carefully about it. Okay, so in 2021, I started working for an institute called the Psyche Institute, and they're based in Melbourne, Australia. And they're doing work towards the medicalization of ayahuasca. And this is a not-for-profit research center that aims to develop psychedelic therapies as registered medical treatments. And this involves doing scientific studies in hospital-based settings using standardized versions of ayahuasca. And the reason that we're doing this is to open up the possibility for ayahuasca to be prescribed by medical doctors in the future. So the studies, we're currently still designing them, so I can't say too much about them, but there's a heavy emphasis on preparation and also integration. So at least 3 preparation sessions. So preparation is 1 hour of psychotherapy every week. We're going to try and have as much as we can, funding allowing, and then hopefully 5 or 6 integration sessions following each ayahuasca dosing session. And these sessions, these 1 hour sessions, are going to be based on internal family systems, which is a psychotherapeutic framework based on the multiplicity of mind. So the idea that we have different parts of ourselves that can be stuck at different times in our lives. So, for example, there might be a 5-year-old self who's particularly traumatized from an incident of bullying, and that part of you might come out, and that part is the part that gets healing. We're going to use multiple dosing sessions with ayahuasca, and there's going to be a focus on the somatic or the body experience. So as we've seen, ayahuasca is a very physical experience, or at least it can be. And so we're going to use various techniques such as breathing exercises and mindfulness and guided meditation to help people work through that. And then there's also going to be an emphasis on community. I think one thing that we're seeing, especially with the MAP studies at the moment, is that people after their treatment sessions with MDMA or another psychedelic can feel a little bit left high and dry. And so we're trying to set up regular integration circles at least once a month that people can continue to come back to help try to form the beginnings of some kind of a community. Easier said than done, but we'll start off giving it a shot and see what happens. So the therapeutic approach, much like many of the other psychedelic therapies and psychedelic trials we have, is non-directive. So the therapists are largely there to support the emerging experience of the participants. And as we can see here, there'll always be a dyad, so two therapists, at least one of them will be female, largely to try and help reduce the chances of sexual misconduct, as we mentioned before. And we can see that the participant here will be reclining, they'll be lying down with headphones, listening to music with their eye shades on. And the therapists will try to persuade them to focus on their inner process, but they'll be there to discuss things that come up if the participants want to speak to them. As much as possible, although these studies are being conducted in a hospital, we're going to try to remove or at least conceal as much of the hospital equipment as possible to try and foster a homely setting. So obviously, these studies raise huge ethical considerations for both me and my colleagues. Could this just be a case of cultural or even spiritual appropriation? Is it that people in the West have started to have a bit of an existential crisis? Is it that we've taken the land and the resources of the indigenous populations and now we're working towards the immaterial? There are also huge issues to do with oversimplification. So there are ontological issues. When I give these talks, so when I'm presenting these graphs saying that depression and anxiety decreased, I just feel there's something slightly disingenuous with that. I mean, that obviously is the case, but that's a fraction of the actual experience. That's where we try to do the phenomenological work as well. There are also issues to do with ontological shock. quite often people can completely change their worldview after consuming psychedelics or ayahuasca. And so we need to be, people need to be prepared, participants need to be aware that that could happen. And will it actually work? Now, this one is a particularly interesting question. So, as we briefly touched upon before, from a Western perspective, ayahuasca works by affecting receptors in the brain, so serotonin receptors, much in the way that many of the other psychedelics we have, some of the antidepressants do. But from a traditional point of view, they wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but they would say it's the ceremony that's the important part, and it's the tradition and the connection to spirit that actually causes the healing. And so if you don't have that, then you actually just have a bunch of chemicals, and so don't expect too much. So it will be interesting to see and to compare and contrast the results of the jungle research with the lab-based research. So another point that I actually want to make is it actually ayahuasca? And I'm making this for a variety of reasons. So it's looking more and more likely that we're probably going to actually be using analogs of ayahuasca rather than the traditional ayahuasca plants. So there are various other places that you can get DMT, for example, acacia, which is very prevalent in Australia. And there are also other sources of the hamada alkaloids other than the vines, such as Syrian root. So if we're using these analogs, is it actually ayahuasca? No. I would say that it was some kind of ayahuasca-inspired product. But at the same time, even if we do, or even if other people use the actual plants in the hospital setting, and what we're doing is brewing up vast quantities of ayahuasca, sucking out all the liquid, and then having a powdered form in capsules. So it's the plant material, but it's not the same as the ayahuasca liquid, nor obviously do we have the ceremony. Well, we have some kind of ceremony. It's a different ceremony, but we're replacing shamans with psychotherapists and psychiatrists. I would also argue that that is what makes ayahuasca ayahuasca. So I think that ayahuasca is more of an umbrella term. It encompasses a variety of different things, which is why ayahuasca is such a beautiful tradition, in my opinion. So you have the music, you have the ceremony, you have the different plants, you have the icaros, you have the shaman. And if you don't have those things, I don't think it's ayahuasca. And in fact, I think we should be saving ayahuasca, like it's been said before, saving that name for the use that we more commonly see in South America, much in the same way that we reserve the name champagne for the sparkling wine that comes from a particular region. Okay, so just a few final thoughts. I think whether you agree with it or not, realistically, we need to accept that ayahuasca is spreading. It's now present all around the world. It's present in every single continent. And so I think that the question that we realistically need to be asking is, what can we do to try and make this spread ethical? I think that if we work together with indigenous communities, if we try to give back to and we support those whose knowledge we work with, rather than just extracting it like we have done in the past, as well as respecting other people's traditions whilst allowing for adaptation of those traditions in a safe and effective way, then we might be in with a shot. But most importantly, I think we need to be listening to the experts who use these medicines as we try to learn from them and learn medicine that is from a different paradigm. And if we do all of those things, then perhaps ayahuasca will help us with the mental health crisis that we are currently experiencing. So thank you very much, and more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Really a fascinating line of research you've completed so far and presented here, and really appreciate a lot of the thoughts on the bigger picture as well. What does this all mean, and how to put it all together, and what is ayahuasca even? Let's take some comments and questions. I certainly have quite a few, but let's start with what's already here in the Q&A section, and you can keep posting them here. We have a question here from Heini. Would you like to ask it yourself?
My question was just that to me, if I had the possibility researching ayahuasca would be the most interesting thing. And I'm more like a cultural studies anthropology person, so I would be more interested in studying the impact that the ayahuasca tourism has on the local communities and their culture, and maybe more also study how it affects like Western culture, how it can affect, like change our perspectives, but also how the Westerners are affecting the culture there. And maybe it's a bit difficult to research it, and that was also my question, that is it already well researched, and how to do it, and who would be interested to fund it, and would this type of research be possible at the research center or healing center that was mentioned in this presentation? And then I also found it interesting to maybe, it was also mentioned here that to kind of compare how the Western participants interpret their experience compared to the locals or natives. And yeah, that yeah, maybe also biggest issue is like who is interested in funding it, and what type of research is funded, and is it possible for some random person from Finland to start researching it? And also, is it like, would I do any good? I don't know, if maybe there's already a lot of people on it, but anyway, let me think. There was also more question. Yeah, it's really interesting, the mother experience that many people feel like, and that the mother is speaking to them. So it would be also interesting to study this kind of mother as a stereotype or like archetype, and like, because it's easy to also, I think many people feel like the planet is talking to them, or they feel connected to the like a bigger what is it, well, like that you are part of a bigger organism, and in a relatedness to nature. And yeah, I was also, now this question is go very, very, very long, but also I have to kind of like disagree with the ethicalness of the spreading of ayahuasca, because it might be good in some sense for the communities that they get money, but then they also get dragged into the capitalist system, and also in the capitalist system with the global demand, it will probably make it all more like expensive and more difficult to access for most people. So then it will, then only rich people will have access to it. And maybe that's just how things are, but like, it's like in some sense it's not going to be ethical in all ways. Because like I read somewhere that like in the 80s or 70s, when it wasn't so common, that it was still more like the idea wasn't that you ask money for healing, but if you can give somebody healing, you give it to them. But I mean, of course, if like all the people just travel to the jungle, they can't give it for free anymore, nor should they. But anyway.
Cool, thanks. There's quite a lot there. I'm
sorry.
Try and remember. Okay, so the touching on the last thing you said about the ethical issues. I mean, I completely agree. That's actually what I spend over half my time dealing with, is trying to talk to other people and come up with ways of approaching this kind of work from an ethical perspective. I think the increase in use of ayahuasca causes all the things that you mentioned. developing analogs could be a way to combat that, so that there's a way of providing it to a Western audience that doesn't take away from the indigenous communities. But then at the same time, you could also argue that that was taking away from the indigenous communities even more so. We have these reciprocity initiatives to try and work with them, but at the same time, there's obviously going to be Western people who are in the driver's seat. So it's extremely complicated. In terms of the anthropological research, there is a lot of stuff out there. I recommend you read Professor Louis Luna. He's really, really fantastic. He's written something called the Ayahuasca Reader, amongst many other things, which is really great to look at. And also, Abir Labach has been really prominent in this field as well. One of the good things about psychedelic research is that you do get philanthropic funders, which helps with the relatively little funding that's available in science in general, and it can be really nice to find those people. So certainly, I think there's a role for doing more research in this area. We had one anthropologist who came to the center, and we're certainly up for doing more research in the area. So if you do have any ideas, please do email me afterwards, and perhaps we can talk about it further.
Great, thank you. A few other questions in the Q&A section already. Henry had a question. Do you want to say it yourself?
Sure. So do you have any idea of why there has been no previous psychedelic research that would look into the epigenetic effects?
Why? That's a good question. I mean, I think there are so many things that haven't been looked at in psychedelic research yet, because it's still an emerging field. So with ayahuasca, for example, things like the gut microbiome, it's amazing that no one's kind of focused on that. So I think that there are many, they're almost like low-hanging fruit, things that would be quite easy to look at, and they haven't been looked at yet, largely because there hasn't been much research. So rather than it being particularly difficult to assess, I think that we're probably the first people to get there. But there is another part to that as well. So with the saliva samples that we collected, I think that we're using that to extrapolate to, suggest that maybe that's the same effects are happening in the brain. Of course, we don't know that, and in fact, it's probably quite likely that the effects aren't the same. This is just the best guess that we have at the moment. It'd be slightly better to take blood samples. But all of this is very difficult at the research center and in the jungle when we only have a generator and we'd have to keep the blood samples on ice. Obviously, I don't really know how we could collect samples from the brain at the moment with our technology in humans. So there's also that to consider as well. But I do think with this field in general, there are lots of quite obvious things to look at. And it's not that no one's thought of them, it's that people haven't got there yet, rather than anything else.
I'll add a question here. The last time I looked at the idea of epigenetic markers being inherited in humans a few years ago, it was still sort of undecided whether that actually happens or not. What is the latest? Is it actually proven and shown that they can be inherited through several generations? And if so, what would this mean for psychedelic users? If we are taking psychedelics, are we changing not only our own epigenetics, but maybe that of future generations?
Potentially, and you're quite right. It's still, it's something that's still being investigated, rather than a solid scientific fact at the moment. I think it's important to remember as well that epigenetics is just one piece of an extremely complex puzzle, looking at the effect of the environment and also your inherited DNA. So we need to be very careful when we're extrapolating results and making generalizations. And it's very easy with epigenetics. And there's also been a bit of a pushback against it from people making outrageous claims, and including in pseudoscience. And it's also been included in various novels as well, and various films. So I think we need to, as you say quite rightly, not get ahead of ourselves. But it's a really interesting field. And in terms of what does that mean for us as psychedelic users? Well, I mean, the field of epigenetics is the effect of the environment on the way that our genome is expressed. So yeah, taking psychedelics is one of the ways that will be influenced, but it will be influenced by everything. So, your diet, like where you live, is there pollution? Is there not? Are you stressed? Including, do you take psychedelics? So I think we need to be considering all of our lifestyle choices, and maybe psychedelics are doing something. Hopefully it's positive.
All right. There's a short question here from Timo that I could read aloud. Is the retreat center you mentioned open for everyone? How do these people come to this center in the first place?
For sure. So the retreat center is called the Ayahuasca Foundation. It's ayahuascafoundation.org. And yeah, it's open to everyone. So all of the participants that we have are people who are attending the retreat center anyway. We just, now we have research assistants who are out there, but previously for most of the research I presented now, we would email them a couple of weeks beforehand, and then we would explain what we were doing in the research. If they wanted to consent to the research, then they'd be included in the studies. So they were really just doing it out of their own interest or their own goodwill.
Right. A few questions that have been posted anonymously. Firstly, anonymous attendee reports that he or she had similar experiences when they had a psychotic break, which psychedelics had no part in it. However, my experiences are not seen in the studies as fascinating, but rather only as undesirable and culturally almost pitiable. I think it's fascinating why that's so, because the experiences were really meaningful to me personally. So the person is wondering whether your research and understanding of ayahuasca has expanded your views on psychosis and its treatment.
That's a really good question. I mean, I personally find that, so I now do just research into ayahuasca full time, but certainly when I was still working for the NHS as a psychiatrist, when I was in the jungle, I had to have my psychedelic research, ayahuasca shamanic hat on. And then when I came back to the hospitals in the UK, I had to just switch back to the Western paradigm hat. I think the way of describing psychosis in the Shipibo paradigm is very different from the way that we describe it in the West. And I'm glad to hear that you had such a meaningful experience from it. There's also some interesting literature out there about, is it psychosis? Is it some kind of, spiritual breakthrough, emerging spiritual breakthrough? So it's always fascinating learning things from a different paradigm. But I myself have struggled to integrate them together and find it easier, as I think do many people, to have almost two different bookmarks for when you're working with mental health problems in different paradigms.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. Has it been researched that the only affecting compounds in the ayahuasca brew are DMT and harmines, or harmar alkaloids, I guess? Or could there be yet more unknown compounds which could possibly be part of the experience and benefits?
Oh, for sure. There are loads of, they're called admixtures and additives and loads of other compounds. So because we're dealing with plants, this is one of the interesting things with the studies in Melbourne, because we're using plant material rather than synthesized compounds. There's a whole host of other things that comes with that that's almost definitely affecting the experience. So I think like the last count for the amount of components in cannabis was like over 113. And most people think of just THC and CBD, but actually, there's quite literally over 100 that we know of in there. And in ayahuasca, we have at least 4 main components. So there's almost definitely a whole host of other compounds in there, and we're just not sure what they're doing yet. And in addition, other people put other things in the brew as well. So that's only if you have your basic ayahuasca brew, and there are different leaves and different, as we spoke about, harmala sources you can use. So almost an infinite possibility of what could be in that tea.
Right, yeah. And having read some studies where they've analyzed samples of ayahuasca from different places, both in South America, but also in centers and ceremonies in Europe and the US, you really find a huge difference in the components, and the contents of the brews really
For sure.
vary a lot. Yeah. Maybe to connect to this, you mentioned that perhaps the word ayahuasca could be reserved for the traditional use, including the ceremonies or the tradition of it. Do you have a suggestion for what we should call the rest then, or the other versions or analogs or something?
Yeah, I mean, I need to be careful not to. I probably shouldn't say this. Say this in this talk because we haven't released it yet. But what I will say is that. So we initially started thinking of calling it like DMT harmaloid concoctions. So just a description of what it is. But then one of my friends, Andrea, called me up on it. I was like, well, you wouldn't describe you by just what you're made of. So you wouldn't say that you were blood and muscle and bone. You're more than that. So we moved away from that descriptive term and came up with a bit of a more catchy name for what it is, but I don't want to get in trouble with my professors, so I'm not going to say it in this talk, I'm afraid.
All right, then. It's a question from Angelica. Would you like to say it out loud yourself? Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I wondered, I would like to get to know more about law, regulations, politics. Is there need for some kind of change to implement this kind of therapy based on psychedelic usage, or how is it gonna be started? I was wondering. I know different countries have different law regulations, but I was wondering if there is some kind of general rules or stuff that could also help the researcher when they plan some kind of research to know where is the gray area and where how does this work?
For sure. I mean, the first thing to say, the reason that we were, one of the reasons that we were able to do the research in the Amazon is because ayahuasca is legal in Peru for treatment. In Brazil, it was legal for religious purposes. And so that made it easier for us to do the research. Absolutely, there's a need for people looking into this kind of thing. Excuse me. It's really in two different ways. So we have the lab-based use, the hospital-based use of psychedelics, and potentially ayahuasca and ayahuasca-inspired compounds. And to do that, there needs to be, we start off really to make the research easier, declassifying DMT and the psychedelics from being Schedule 1, which makes it very difficult to do the research into it. But there's also another side to that as well. Which is the use of psychedelics like ayahuasca or psilocybin in settings outside of hospital-based. So, for example, there are many retreat centers that are springing up in the Netherlands, and there are other centers operating underground. So working towards decriminalization is also really important as well, which will open up a whole other field and a whole other way that these compounds might be used.
Thank you. Another question or comment from an anonymous attendee regarding the idea of a spirit. What do you think about the idea that, for example, the spirit of ayahuasca is sort of a shorthand to all the attributes of the plants, including the patterns the plants exhibit when growing in the natural environment, their chemical composition, maybe ways that ayahuasca brew affects people, the relationships and history that people have with the plants and their effects, the evolutionary history of the plants, and so on. So some might call this reductive, but for me, it has added clarity to thinking about what animists might mean when they refer to spirits.
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to my own personal experiences. I initially started trying to describe or explain to myself the word spirit in terms of the pharmacological components of whichever plant, we're consuming. And so when people describe the spirit or the character of the plant, thinking of it in terms of, well, it affects more serotonin receptors. But again, trying to fit that reductionist Western way of thinking into the Shipibo paradigm shortly and very quickly just fell apart. So once again, I go back to having my Shipibo traditional paradigm hat on, and that way of thinking when I'm in those ceremonies, when I'm in that space, is a difficult one to answer. I find it personally for myself difficult. And I'm not essentially sure that we should be trying to fit our own framework of understanding onto the Indigenous way of understanding. I think there could be some merit in doing that. But for the most part, when I'm working with the shamans, they're the experts. And so if they say spirit, I try to respect that.
Yeah. Maybe one question I could pose at this point, since you did mention in your talk as well, the possibility of changes in worldview and beliefs. And this is something that has been discussed in the literature increasingly, I'd say, in the last year or so. Like the extent that psychedelics, and perhaps ayahuasca in particular, causes people to change the way they view the world and even religious or spiritual beliefs and so on. Maybe especially belief in a spirit world or spirits or something like that. What do you think about that overall? Is it a problem if we think about ayahuasca or the psychedelics as medicines? Is this sort of a side effect that we would have to sort of warn people about beforehand? You might change the way you think about the world. And one term that has come up in this discussion is also the comforting delusion idea, that if somebody's, let's say, healed from their depression, but only because they now believe that there are spirits everywhere that are carrying them from place to place and are protecting them. If many people might say this could be a comforting thought, but it could also be a false thought, like from the perspective of that person's worldview before, or the worldview of their, let's say, family and society and so on. What do you think about this topic?
Yeah, really interesting. Really, really interesting. I mean, this is something that's been coming up quite a lot recently, especially with the clinical trials looking at DMT that are happening at Imperial College London, here in London. This issue of ontological shock. Most people don't expect to have their worldview changed by a treatment that they get in a hospital. And so I do indeed think that we need to be, it's not ethical not to be broaching that, to be preparing participants for that, to, for them to have a working understanding that is, that has the potential to happen. And that could be the most wonderful thing if you have support, if you're prepared for it. But that could also be completely disarming, completely shake your whole world as well as your whole worldview, and have disastrous consequences. So I think we need to be very careful. I think it comes back to appropriate preparation, knowing that, letting people know what could happen to them, and then also, as much as possible, having informed psychiatrists and psychologists who, I mean, it's probably never going to be easy for anyone, but if they did perceive it to be potentially extremely problematic in a participant, understanding that and bearing that in mind when they're deciding who to accept onto these trials.
Maybe to continue on that a little bit, the part about the comforting delusion, if I could still have your opinion on that. Let's say that we do find that ayahuasca works very well in depression in quite a lot of people, but it does so by making them become animists. Is it sort of, or let's say that it makes 10% of the people who participate into some sort of religious believers or something like that, that it has a profound effect like this.
Yeah.
Would you still consider it ethical to use it as a treatment?
Well, I think that one thing we need to be very careful about when people are attending these retreats, but also attending these trials, is the issue of spiritual bypassing. And I think that, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with suddenly believing that spirits are guiding you or anything along those lines. But I think that there is big dangers and big issues with people who just do that and don't deal with any of their problems and face their problems. And in my experience of seeing people doing that, it usually comes back to bite them pretty hard. So I do think that we need to be, that's one of the therapeutic challenges that we need to be aware of, both therapeutically and ethically, in my opinion.
Yeah, a few more questions have popped up. Radar here thanks you for a very interesting presentation and asks, even though it's early on, do you think that there could be certain patient groups benefiting more from ayahuasca-based treatments compared to, for example, psilocybin-based? And that's actually something I was wondering as well. What do you see as the main difference between, for example, ayahuasca and psilocybin in terms of the treatment or therapeutic potential?
Yeah, from my own personal experience, I would tentatively suggest that ayahuasca might be better in lifting very heavy trauma. So, for example, things like PTSD, very heavy things like that, moreover, something like MDMA. But I should also point out that not everyone thinks this. So I said something along those lines when I was on a panel with Bill Richards, who's very much like the godfather of, or one of them, of psychedelic research. And he disagreed and said, no, he thinks that in his experience, it doesn't matter whether it's ayahuasca, psilocybin, LSD, you go to the same place. It takes you to the same place. It's probably more to do with dose rather than anything else. But for me personally, I feel that MDMA might be better for things like anxiety and depression. Ayahuasca might be better for things like PTSD and heavy trauma. But I do want to caveat that by saying, but of course, we need to wait for the data before we actually draw any conclusions about that.
Yeah, interesting question. A recent study comes to mind where at least healthy participants were not able to differentiate between LSD and psilocybin. If they didn't know which it was, they couldn't actually tell. But I think a study like that is probably pretty hard to carry out with ayahuasca, considering all the somatic components. Yeah,
that would be more challenging for sure.
This question for anonymous attendee. As the brew contains many affecting compounds, if it will be used in a medical area, should it then always be prepared from the original plants and not only mixing similar plants or only these two main compounds? I think you touched upon this a little bit. Or do you think there's a way to make this ayahuasca experience with synthesized compounds so that the nature wouldn't be exploited if ayahuasca will be used as a medical treatment someday?
Oh, for sure. It's already happening. So there's a team who are synthesizing DMT and Hamara alkaloids and using that. It's called Pharmahuasca. It is interesting. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with doing that at all. I think when we're comparing the worldviews and when we're thinking about the various other compounds that might be present in the plants, I wonder if we'll be missing out on something. But yet again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with branching out to other ways of getting ayahuasca-inspired products, as long as we're giving back and as long as we're working with indigenous communities when doing that. I think that there is a risk when we move towards synthesized chemicals instead of plant materials. So, for example, this is happening also with ibogaine, not just ayahuasca and iboga, that people can wash their hands and say it's synthesized. We don't need to be working with indigenous communities. This is completely separate, and kind of wash their hands of reciprocity. I don't think that's true at all. I think that reciprocity can come from anywhere. If we're using things that take inspiration from indigenous communities, we need to be working with those communities. But even for things like MDMA, there's no reason. I would very much suggest that people working with MDMA also gave back, and it can, instead of being to a Shipibo tribe, it could be to reforestation or the climate in general. Does it really matter? I would argue not.
A question here from Henry. Do you want to say it out loud?
Sure. So There's been criticism on the results regarding psychedelics advancing pro-environmental and anti-authoritarian stances. The criticisms have pointed out that the study designs are at least partly unable to account for the fact that people holding such views might generally be more keen to use psychedelics. It's been suggested that while such views might be strengthened by psychedelics, people with opposing views might have their views strengthened instead. So what do you think about this? And yeah, thanks, by the way, for a fascinating lecture.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Sorry, there was a truck going past in that last bit. So the last bit of the question was, if people with opposing views were to take psychedelics, it might make them more set in their opposing views.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. That's a really, really interesting one, isn't it? So for the majority of research out there, it seems you're quite right that people might become more interested in the environment, they might become more open, they might become less neurotic. But then as far as I'm aware, there isn't research suggesting that that's not the case. But I remember asking one of the curanderos, asking the shaman about this. And there's this typical thing of like, what happens if Donald Trump were to drink ayahuasca? Would he suddenly turn into a nice guy and see potentially the errors of his ways? And the shamans and the facilitators that I work with seem to be of the opinion that wouldn't happen. That he'd probably get more complicated and more inventive ideas in how to continue doing the work that he wants to do. I'm also reminded of there's this famous biker gang in the States. I can't remember what they're called. Their name escapes me now, but they used to take large quantities of LSD, of acid, and then drive around and commit lots of murder and lots of crimes. And so I think that we do need to be careful when we're thinking of psychedelics as this kind of savior, this kind of magic bullet. And again, it reminds me of the use of ayahuasca in indigenous populations. Historically, and when it's used for witchcraft and hunting and for warfare. So I don't think that it necessarily leads to what we would perceive to be positive outcomes. And I do agree with the criticism of that research and indeed my own research.
Oh, fascinating area, definitely. I think there still is this idea or cliche of psychedelics always promoting peace and harmony and nature connectedness. But certainly, as you pointed out, historical examples and also I've heard reports of, even in contemporary times, groups of organized crime using retreats to come together and then continue their activities. So that sort of anecdote at least suggests that it doesn't automatically change people in one particular direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question I had in mind that I wanted to ask was about the mystical experience. You mentioned here in one of the studies, at least, that it wasn't the mystical experience in this case that was so much connected with the results. And there are findings in all kinds of directions, but something that's been debated quite a bit as well. Is it the connection with the universe or God or higher powers and spirits and so on? Or perhaps are some of the key insights or the key experiences, are they more personal and psychological in nature that then lead to some sort of healing or recovery and so on? You did mention some other factors that might affect it as well, but what do you think overall in your research and experience? What is the role of having personal insights about your particular situation and psychology and so on versus something like feeling connected to the whole world or nature?
I think, again, just based on my own personal experiences and the participants that I've worked with in these studies, there seems to be an interesting shift in perspective that takes place with mystical experiences that puts things into perspective. And I'm reminded of, I think it was Buzz Aldrin, it might have been one of the astronauts, when they first went up into space and were looking at the world, and they could suddenly appreciate how small they were, how there were no borders, how beautiful it all was. And it put everything in perspective. And suddenly the squabble they were having with their brother, the small arguments with their wife over picking kids up from school, just didn't matter at all. And I think that that's something that seems to come across when I've spoken to participants, and indeed in my own personal experience, for being one of the ways in which mystical experience might be resulting in those changes in outcomes. But obviously that's just one way of describing it, and there are a whole host of neurological, neurobiological, psychological, all of these different ways of thinking about it that we touched on briefly in the talk.
You also mentioned the effects of expectations and managing expectations at retreats, and also this applies to scientific studies, or let's say treatment, if that becomes a reality later. Could you share some thoughts on that? What sort of problematic media coverage do we see now? How could it be a little bit better or more realistic in order not to create these expectations?
I think one of the most dangerous things, so I've definitely been with participants who have just been, kind of pissed off. They've kind of wanted their money back, or they've wanted to leave the trial, or, they felt that they didn't get the treatment that they paid for or what they signed up for. But I think that there's also another side to that, which could be potentially more dangerous. It's something that I have seen as well, where people, for whatever reason, think that it's their fault. So go down the line of, it didn't work properly. This always happens to me. It must be because I didn't deserve it. I'm a bad person. And then I think potentially that could even make things worse. They could pop out the other side thinking, and this has been the case with some of the participants on the MAP studies. They hear about these miracle treatments online or on the news or whatever. And then when it doesn't work for them, they're like, it's my fault. Even I couldn't engage properly with the miracle treatment. And then they feel even lower than they did before. How do we approach that? I think with more realistic coverage on the effects that psychedelics can have. There seems to be a shift in that now. It's almost like the pendulum has swung from initially over the last kind of 5 years, it almost felt to vindicate someone who had been wrongly accused. And now we seem to be heading towards like the other way of psychedelic research is far too lax. We need to be far more strict with all of our studies. Hopefully we'll end up somewhere in the middle at some point, and there'll be some balance. But I think just having that balanced approach in the media, and for us as well, when we talk to people and when we present results, is really important for the benefits of our patients.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we're more or less at the end of our time here. Thank you very much for answering all these questions and for all these good questions. Do you have some final words or thoughts you'd like to say here, Simon?
Just a big thank you for having me. Real pleasure to be here, and please do email me if you want to continue the conversation or have any more questions or have some ideas about collaboration. More than happy to discuss further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Simon Ruffell, for being our guest tonight. And thank you also to all participants. If you're not a member of the association yet, you can consider joining at psyty.fi, psyty.fi, and do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube to see what's coming up in the future. All right. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.